Hey everyone, thanks for tuning in. If you're new here, consider subscribing. It really helps keep these stories coming. And while you're here, let me know in the comments where you're listening from. Now, sit back, relax, and let's get into the story. I should have gone home early that night. 12-hour shifts in the emergency department were exhausting enough on a normal day, but that night was something else. The full moon hung low in the sky, casting an eerie glow through the high hospital windows. I had always laughed off the superstition that the ER got busier during a full moon, but I wasn't laughing anymore. It started with a man in his mid-40s, brought in by ambulance after collapsing at a gas station. He was unresponsive, his pulse erratic, and his skin pale. Not the kind of pale you see in a feverish patient, but something different, waxy, unnatural, like the color had been drained out of him completely. His breathing was shallow, and his pupils barely responded to light. The paramedics said he had no ID, no wallet, nothing to tell us who he was or where he came from. The nurses worked quickly, setting up IV lines, running tests. I asked the paramedics if he had spoken at all before losing consciousness. One of them, a seasoned guy named Ray, shook his head. "No words, Doc, just a lot of..." He hesitated, searching for the right description. Thrashing, like he was fighting something off that wasn't there. The man's vitals were plummeting. His heart rate slowed to a near standstill. I grabbed the defibrillator paddles, ready to deliver a shock, when his body convulsed violently, so violently that one of the nurses gasped and stepped back. His eyes shot open. For a fraction of a second, I felt relief. Then he lunged. It happened too fast to process. 1 second he was flatlining, the next he was moving like a man possessed, teeth bared, fingers clawing at the nearest person, one of the interns. A young guy named Patel. The patient knocked over a tray of instruments, sending scalpels clattering to the floor. We struggled to restrain him, but he was unnaturally strong. It took 3 of us to pin him down while security rushed in. Even as we sedated him, his body continued to jerk and spasm, his fingers grasping at the air. A guttural sound escaped his throat, not quite a growl, not quite a moan. Something inhuman. We transferred him to an isolation room, still unsure what we were dealing with, but deep down, I think I already knew. This was just the beginning. The patient's condition should have been impossible. I stood outside his isolation room, staring through the reinforced glass. Even under heavy sedation, he twitched and jerked against the restraints. His skin had taken on a sickly gray tone, and his lips were dry and cracked. His breathing was ragged, uneven, like each breath was a battle. Patel, the intern he had attacked, was sitting in an exam room down the hall, his hands trembling as he pressed gauze against the bite mark on his arm. The wound wasn't deep, just an imprint of teeth where the man had snapped at him before security intervened. But something about it made me uneasy. Ray, the paramedic who had brought the man in, leaned against the wall beside me. "What the hell is wrong with that guy?" he muttered. I didn't have an answer. We had ruled out a drug overdose, infection, even neurological conditions. Nothing explained his sheer strength, the way his body had fought against what should have been a fatal collapse. Then the monitors started screaming. I turned back to the isolation room just in time to see the patient's body convulse again, once, twice, before his back arched at an unnatural angle. The heart monitor flatlined. He was gone. For a long second, the only sound was the beeping of the machines. The nurses exchanged uncertain glances. Then, his head snapped toward me. His body should have been lifeless, but his eyes locked onto mine through the glass, wide, bloodshot, filled with something primal and hungry. And then, despite the restraints digging into his wrists and ankles, he moved. The leather straps strained, the metal clasps groaning under the force. His lips peeled back in a snarl, revealing teeth that looked sharper than before. Then, a sickening snap. The bones in his wrist cracked as he twisted free of one restraint. His fingers flexed unnaturally, and then he went for the other. The nurse beside me screamed. "Lock the door," I ordered, backing away. "Now." But it was too late. With a final guttural sound, the patient ripped free of his remaining restraints, swinging himself off the gurney. His body sagged for just a moment before straightening, as if something inside him was still adjusting. And then, he charged at the glass. The impact rattled the entire isolation room. His face slammed against the reinforced window, leaving a smear of something dark behind. His hands clawed at it, nails scraping against the surface. But I wasn't staring at his frenzied movements anymore. I was staring at his mouth, at his teeth, because they were growing. I had seen a lot of horrifying things in my career. Car crash, victims barely clinging to life. Burn patients covered in raw, peeling flesh. People who had been cut apart and stitched back together. But nothing compared to what was happening inside that isolation room. The patient, no, the thing, that used to be a patient slammed against the reinforced glass again, harder this time. His face was twisted into a grotesque expression. His lips pulled back to reveal teeth that looked sharper. They were lengthening, thinning, more needle-like than human. His gums were dark, almost black, and something thick and viscous dripped from his mouth. Then, a new sound filled the ER, a deep, wet crack. I watched in horror as the creature's lower jaw distended, opening too wide like a snake unhinging its mouth. The bones beneath his skin shifted, reshaping, adapting into something wrong. The nurse beside me gasped, clutching my arm. "Doctor, we have to call someone." I swallowed hard, forcing myself to think. My first instinct was to get security, to get backup, except security was already here. They were the ones who had strapped him down in the first place. And if those reinforced restraints hadn't been enough, what the hell was? Another impact. A spiderweb of cracks spread across the reinforced glass. That was all I needed. "We have to move," I said, turning to the nurse. "Now." I grabbed her wrist and yanked her away just as the window exploded. Shards of glass shot through the air, embedding into the walls, the floor, the nearby equipment. A few pieces sliced across my cheek, but I barely noticed. The only thing I focused on was the thing crawling out of the shattered remains of the isolation room. It didn't move like a person anymore. It skittered, almost hunched over, its head jerking from side to side in short, rapid movements. Its eyes, once human, now clouded with something unnatural, locked onto us. Then it sprinted. It was fast, too fast. The nurse screamed as it lunged. I barely managed to shove her aside before its clawed fingers swiped at the space where she had been standing. The thing tumbled forward, but landed on all fours. Like an animal, it twisted its head unnaturally, refocusing on us. There was no time to think. I grabbed the nearest metal tray and hurled it. The impact did nothing. It just rebounded off its shoulder with a hollow clang, but it gave me a fraction of a second to act. I grabbed the nurse's hand and ran. Down the hallway, past the nurse's station, past the waiting area, where the few remaining overnight patients turned in confusion. I didn't stop, didn't look back. I only heard it. The pounding footsteps behind us. The ragged, snarling breath. The unnatural, hungry sound. We burst through the double doors leading into the restricted staff area and slammed them shut behind us. The thing collided with the other side, shaking the heavy doors on their hinges. I backed away, my mind racing. There was no way that was human. No disease did this. No drug, no neurological condition, nothing I had ever studied. This was something else. Something we weren't meant to understand. And then I realized something even worse. That patient had been brought in by ambulance, which meant he wasn't the only one out there. The pounding on the double doors didn't stop. Each impact sent vibrations through the walls, rattling the overhead lights. The nurse beside me was sobbing, her hands clamped over her mouth to muffle the sound. I forced myself to think. The hospital had security, a lockdown protocol. But this wasn't an armed intruder or an infectious outbreak we could contain. This was something else, something that wasn't supposed to exist. A final deafening bang against the door made me flinch. Then, silence. The thing had stopped. I exchanged a glance with the nurse. She was shaking, her breathing shallow and uneven. I held up a hand, signaling for her to stay put, then took a cautious step forward. For a long moment, nothing moved. Then, slowly, I pressed my ear against the door. Silence. A deep, gut-wrenching instinct told me that was somehow worse. I reached for the handle. The second my fingers brushed the metal, something slammed against the other side. I barely had time to stumble back before the door buckled inward, warping from the sheer force of the impact. A sound tore through the air. A rasping, guttural noise that barely resembled a human voice anymore. It was still there. It was waiting. I grabbed the nurse's arm and pulled her away. We need to find another exit. She nodded, tears streaking her face, and we moved. We hurried down the corridor, past the break room, past the empty offices. I fumbled for my ID badge, swiping it over a locked security door. It clicked open, and we slipped inside, locking it behind us. The stairwell. I hesitated, glancing down the dimly lit steps. The hospital basement was below, storage rooms, maintenance tunnels. But the parking garage was up. If we could make it to my car, we could get out. I turned to the nurse. "We go up." She nodded, and we moved. We had only climbed 2 flights before I heard it again. A door slamming open below us. The screech of metal against tile. And then, footsteps. Not rushed, but deliberate. Slow, like it knew exactly where we were going. I swallowed hard, gripping the railing. The nurse's breathing was ragged, her hand clutching my sleeve. Then, something new. More footsteps. Not just one set, multiple. My stomach dropped. The thing in the ER wasn't alone. I tightened my grip on the nurse's arm. Run. We bolted, taking the steps 2, 3 at a time. The sound of pursuit grew louder, closer. The stairwell walls echoed with movement, shuffling, dragging, climbing. A guttural screech filled the space below us. Then, something hit the stairs on all fours and started bounding up after us. The door to the parking garage was just ahead. I reached it, fumbling with my badge, swiping it so hard the plastic bent. Nothing. I swiped again. The reader beeped. The light flashed green. The door clicked open. I shoved the nurse through first and followed, slamming it shut just as something crashed into the other side. For a moment, neither of us moved. The only sound was our ragged breathing. Then, the nurse whispered, "Doctor, look." I turned and felt my stomach drop. The parking garage wasn't empty. Shadows moved between the rows of cars, dozens of them. Figures slumped forward, twitching, heads snapping up at the sound of the door. One of them turned. Its face was barely human anymore. And then, all at once, they charged. They moved like a swarm. not the slow, shuffling creatures from horror movies. These things were fast, their bodies jerked with unnatural energy, some crawling over cars like insects, others sprinting across the concrete on all fours. Their eyes glowed with a sickly, dead light, and their mouths, those gaping, twisted mouths, were open too wide, lined with needle-like teeth. The nurse beside me let out a choked sob. I grabbed her wrist. "Run." We bolted toward the far end of the garage, weaving between rows of parked cars. The overhead lights flickered, casting long, twisting shadows across the floor. The air was thick with the sound of scraping, snarling, pounding footsteps. Something lunged at me from the side. I ducked just in time, feeling a rush of air as a creature soared over me, colliding with the hood of a car. The impact crumpled the metal like tinfoil, but it barely seemed to notice. It twisted unnaturally, its bones cracking as it reoriented itself. We reached my car. I fumbled for my keys, hands shaking. Pressed the button. The headlights flashed, the doors unlocked. I wrenched the driver's door open and shoved the nurse inside. I scrambled in after her, slamming the door just as one of the creatures hit the window. The glass splintered but didn't break. I jammed the key into the ignition. The car roared to life. A figure climbed onto the hood, its elongated fingers clawing at the windshield. Its face was split into something between a grin and a snarl, its mouth stretching impossibly wide, teeth lengthening right before my eyes. I slammed the gas pedal. The tires screeched, the force throwing the creature backward. The others swarmed, closing in. I swerved around them, metal scraping against the concrete walls as I sped toward the exit ramp. The barrier arm was still down. I didn't slow. The car plowed through the wooden arm, splintering it into pieces. I turned onto the main road, tires screeching, barely missing an overturned ambulance. For a brief, horrifying moment, I glanced in the rearview mirror. The creatures stood at the garage entrance, staring, watching. Then, as if driven by some unspoken command, they turned and scattered into the city. I gripped the wheel tighter. My pulse pounded in my ears. This wasn't just an outbreak. It was a hunt, and the city was their hunting ground. The city was already falling apart. As I sped down the road, the first thing I noticed was the silence. No sirens, no honking, no distant hum of life. Just an eerie, unnatural quiet. Then, in the distance, screams. The nurse beside me was hyperventilating, her fingers digging into the dashboard. "Doctor, what's happening?" I didn't answer, because I didn't know. Streetlights flickered above as I swerved around abandoned cars, some still running, their doors wide open. Bodies littered the sidewalks, not moving, not twitching, just left there. And the worst part, some of them didn't even look injured. They looked drained. Something caught my eye. A figure stumbling out of a convenience store, clutching their stomach. Blood soaked through their scrubs. A paramedic. I slammed the brakes. He staggered toward the car, waving frantically. "Please, help me." I threw the door open. "Get in." The nurse reached for him, but then a blur of movement. Something yanked him backward into the darkness. His scream was cut short. Then silence. We didn't move. For a long, horrifying second, I swore I saw something shift in the shadows of the alley. Something crouched, waiting, watching. The nurse whispered, "Drive." I didn't hesitate. I slammed the gas pedal, tearing down the street as fast as the car would go. We had to find safety. The police station, the fire department, anywhere with people. But as we turned a corner, my stomach dropped. A bus had crashed into a row of buildings, its windshield smeared with something dark. Beyond it, a crowd of figures moved in the street, stumbling, twitching, their heads jerking in unnatural ways. Then, all at once, they turned toward us. Their eyes locked onto the car. And then they charged. I spun the wheel, nearly losing control. The car fishtailed as I turned down a side street, barely missing a wrecked motorcycle. My heart pounded. They weren't just wandering. They were searching, hunting. The nurse clutched my arm. "Where are we going?" I swallowed hard, forcing my mind to focus. We needed shelter. Not just for now, but long enough to figure out what was happening. Then I saw it. A hospital. Not my hospital, but a smaller private clinic. The windows were barred, the entrance partially blocked by a row of abandoned police cars. It wasn't perfect, but it was something. I turned sharply, speeding toward it. Because one thing was clear. The city wasn't safe anymore. And if we didn't find somewhere to hide, we wouldn't last the night. The clinic loomed ahead, its barred windows and abandoned police cars making it look more like a fortress than a hospital. I swerved into the parking lot, tires screeching as I skidded to a stop near the entrance. The nurse was shaking. "Do you think anyone's inside?" "I don't know," I admitted, "but we don't have a choice." I killed the engine. The moment the headlights flicked off, the world seemed too quiet. Then a distant howl. Not human, not animal, something in between. I clenched my jaw, no time to hesitate. I grabbed the nurse's hand and we sprinted toward the clinic's front doors. The entrance was partially blocked by two overturned police cars, their emergency lights still faintly flashing. Someone had tried to make a barricade. Had it worked? I banged on the door. "Hello? Is anyone in there? We need help." No response. The nurse pressed her face to the glass, peering inside. "I don't see anyone." I tried the handle, locked. I pounded again, harder. "If anyone's inside, open up. We're not—" A movement behind the glass. A figure stepped into view. A man, late 40s, scrubs stained with blood. His eyes were hollow, exhausted. But he was alive. For a second, he just stared at us. Then, he moved. The door cracked open an inch, just enough for his voice to slip through. "You followed?" I blinked. "What? Were you followed?" His voice was sharp, urgent. I looked back at the empty parking lot, the shadows between the cars, the rooftops, the distant alleyways. "Nothing. I don't think so," I said. The man hesitated, then yanked the door open. Inside now, we didn't argue. The second we stepped in, he slammed it shut, locking it with a heavy metal bar. "Stay away from the windows," he muttered, leading us deeper inside. The clinic was dimly lit, emergency lights casting everything in a dull red glow. Medical carts were overturned, beds shoved against the walls. It was clear whoever had been here had tried to fortify the place. The man led us to a back room, where a handful of people sat in tense silence. A woman in a paramedic uniform. A teenager clutching a baseball bat. An older man with a hunting rifle resting across his lap. The survivors. The man who let us in turned to me. "Doctor?" I nodded. His shoulders sagged. "Good. We need one." I frowned. "For what?" He hesitated. Then he motioned toward the farthest corner of the room. I hadn't noticed the hospital bed before. Hadn't seen the person strapped to it. But now I did. A young man, barely 20. His skin was pale, slick with sweat. His eyes fluttered open, bloodshot, glassy. And on his arm a bite. Not old, not festering. Fresh. I swallowed hard. And that's when the man beside me said the words I had been dreading since this nightmare began. "We need to know if it can be stopped." The air in the clinic was thick with tension. I stared at the bite on the young man's arm, red inflamed, veins darkening beneath the surface like ink bleeding through paper. I had seen infected wounds before. This was different. I turned to the man who had let us in. How long ago was he bitten? An hour, maybe 2. My stomach sank. If this was like any other infection, the body would already be fighting it. Fever, sweating, maybe even shock. But if this was the same thing that I had seen in the hospital, there was no fighting it. The nurse beside me swallowed hard. What do we do? The man tightened his grip on the hunting rifle. We need to know if we have time. If there's any way to stop it before... He didn't finish the sentence. Before the young man turned. I looked at the others. The woman in the paramedic uniform had her arms crossed, tense, like she had already made her decision. The teenager clutched his bat a little tighter. They were scared. I was scared too. I moved to the bedside. The young man blinked up at me, barely conscious. Am I gonna die? I hesitated. I had never lied to a patient before, but this wasn't a normal case. This wasn't something I could fix. I glanced at the wound again. Darker now, the veins pulsing, spreading. I met his gaze. I'm going to do everything I can. It wasn't a lie. Not exactly. I reached for a medical kit, my hands steady despite the storm inside my head. I had no cure, no treatment. But I could at least try. I cleaned the wound, bandaged it, monitored his vitals. But deep down, I already knew. It wouldn't matter. The infection wasn't slowing, it was accelerating. Minutes passed. The young man's breathing grew shallower. His muscles twitched involuntarily. Then his eyes snapped open. But they weren't his eyes anymore. They were clouded. Wrong. The paramedic whispered, "Doctor." The young man spasmed violently. His back arched, his fingers curling into claws. A deep, guttural clicking sound came from his throat. The teenager stumbled back. Oh my God! I grabbed the closest medical instrument, a scalpel, but I already knew I wouldn't need it. Because the man with the rifle was faster. A single deafening boom filled the room. The body went still. Silence. The paramedic looked away. The teenager was shaking. The man with the rifle exhaled, lowering the barrel. His hands were steady. This wasn't the first time he had done this. The nurse wiped her face with trembling hands. I just stood there. The body on the table wasn't the first victim I had lost tonight. And it wouldn't be the last. The man turned to me. Now you see? I nodded. I saw. This wasn't a disease. It was a death sentence, and we were running out of time. Somewhere in the distance, beyond the boarded-up windows of the clinic, a sound echoed through the empty streets. A howl, then another, and another. The hunt wasn't over. It was just beginning. Thanks for listening. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to like and subscribe. Your support keeps these creepypastas coming. Until next time, stay alert, stay safe, and never ignore the feeling that something is watching.